The UN Security Council is due to vote on the Palestinian bid for statehood in the next couple of weeks. What do you think the reaction might be from the Arab world if that's unsuccessful?
It almost certainly, well, if it's in the Security Council, the U.S. will veto it or delay it. In the General Assembly, it really depends very much on how Europe reacts. Most of the world supports Palestinian statehood. In fact, Palestinian statehood is supported by far more of the world than, say, Kosovo independence. The difference is that the United States has a different position on the two cases. In the Arab and Muslim world, and in fact most of the global South, so-called Third World, the reaction will be pretty negative, already is. Problem is, what's Europe going to do? Will Europe join the rest of the world, or will it, what amounts to following U.S. orders? There's a good reason why the Palestinians went to the United Nations, and we should pay some attention to it. The standard line in the West is that Israel is calling for negotiations without preconditions, and the Palestinian Authority is insisting on preconditions. Well, that's a propagandistic way of viewing the situation. You can look at it quite differently, and I think more accurately. The United States and Israel, for 35 years, have been blocking a diplomatic settlement. I can't run through the details now, but that's exactly what's been happening. And they have preconditions. The preconditions are that the United States organize the negotiations, meaning it's organized by the leader of the rejection camp, which has been blocking diplomatic settlement, and that Israel must be allowed to continue to build settlements with U.S. backing, despite rhetoric. Well, everyone agrees that the settlements are illegal. In fact, Israel itself agreed to that years ago. The Security Council, International Court of Justice, there's no real disagreement on that. So the U.S.-Israeli preconditions are the negotiations have to be run by the country that has been blocking a diplomatic settlement for 35 years and still does, and supports one of the two participants, and that Israel be permitted to continue with its illegal actions in the occupied territories. Those are pretty strong preconditions. I mean, if there were real negotiations going on, they'd be organized by some neutral party, you know, Brazil, I don't know who. And on one side, you'd have the United States and Israel. On the rest of the side, you'd have almost the entire world. Those would be negotiations. But given the preconditions that the U.S. and Israel insist on, the Palestinian Authority understands perfectly well, as the rest of the world does, that they're not going to go anywhere. Negotiations can go on like this forever in that framework. Israel will continue with U.S. backing to take over what it wants of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, which it's developing, which kind of imprisons the rest, separate it from Gaza and maintain the siege on Gaza. They can continue with that within the framework of these so-called negotiations. So, of course, neither the Palestinians nor anyone else with eyes open expects anything from that. And therefore they went to the UN. Whether that was a wise tactical move or not, you could debate, but certainly understandable.
Well, we've seen Egypt play more of a mediating role in the region. It helped to broker a deal between Israel and Hamas. Do you see Egypt playing a bigger role in the region and perhaps the US's influence diminishing?
The U.S. influence is very seriously diminishing because the U.S. is becoming an object of ridicule. Last February, for example, when Obama vetoed a Security Council resolution calling for official U.S. policy to be implemented, that simply caused ridicule in most of the world. Not in Europe, probably not in Australia, but in most of the world it did, for perfectly good reasons. Most of the world perceives what I think is pretty evident, that the entire diplomatic framework is a mechanism for preventing a diplomatic settlement. I mean, there's an overwhelming consensus in the world, and has been for decades, on the basic form of a political settlement. A two-state settlement on the international border with minor and mutual modifications. That was official U.S. terminology back in the early 70s when the U.S. was still part of the world. Well, and then various other things to be settled here and there. That's the basic framework of a settlement. Overwhelming support for it in the world. The U.S. has been blocking it. Israel, of course, doesn't want it. They want to integrate the territories and keep Gaza and the West Bank separate in violation of the Oslo Accords. Now, there have been a few departures in U.S. policy. One major departure. It was in Clinton's last term, the last month of his second term in January 2001. Clinton did authorize negotiations which took place in Taba, Egypt, between Israel and the Palestinians in the framework of what he called his parameters. As he pointed out, both sides accepted the parameters, both sides had reservations. They were supposed to meet in Taba and deal with the reservations. We have a pretty good record of that from Israeli sources and also international sources. It appears that the two sides were pretty close to a settlement. In fact, in their last press conference, they said if they had a little more time, they might have been able to resolve all the issues. But the negotiations were called off prematurely by Israel, and they never proceeded. That strongly suggests that if a U.S. president is willing just to tolerate a diplomatic settlement along the lines of the international consensus, it might be realized. Now, lots happened since 2001, but I think it's still probably true.
So do you have any hope that perhaps Obama could pick up where Clinton left off?
If he radically changes his position. From the very beginning, it's been obvious that he's one of the most extremist of U.S. presidents on this. Actually, I wrote about that before the primaries even, and he's followed that position. Now, he makes some nice words about don't expand the settlements, but then he proceeds to assist in settlement expansion. He didn't even take the measures that the senior first President Bush did. Bush and his first Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, were pretty much offended by the brazen manner in which Israel was carrying out settlement expansion right under their noses. Like when the Secretary of State would go to Jerusalem, they would pick that day, to start a new settlement. Well, they were insulted, didn't like that, and they, in fact, informed Israel that they would impose sanctions. And they did impose, not very extreme, but mild sanctions to indicate displeasure about the illegal expansion of settlements, and particularly the manner it was being done. They were kind of modified, but they were dropped essentially by Clinton. Obama was asked in one of the early press conferences whether he would go as far as Bush 1 did when he announced there shouldn't be any more settlements, and he said no. His spokesman said no, that this was just symbolic. That's a way of telling Prime Minister Netanyahu, do whatever you feel like, and we'll keep funding it, which is exactly what's happened. In fact, right at this moment, they're continuing to build settlements in Jerusalem, expanded Jerusalem. That's doubly illegal. All the settlement building is illegal. That's no real controversy on that. In what they call Jerusalem, the expanded area, it's also in violation of explicit Security Council resolutions that go back to 1968. But they're doing it, and they can do it with impunity as long as the United States pats them on the head and funds it.
Well, you've said that President Obama is one of the most extreme presidents in US history.
With regard to this issue.
Who then do you regard as the most dangerous person in the world at the moment? It's
usually the case over time that the most powerful person is likely to be ranked pretty high among the most dangerous people for pretty obvious reasons, and I think that may well be the case today.
So who might that be?
The most powerful person in the world. It's not an individual. It's a structure. It's a system of power. where power is concentrated globally, it's usually likely to be pretty dangerous. And I think that's been the case throughout most of history. It still is.